Hello, morning, or afternoon, evening,
Morning.
wherever you are.
Hello, everybody. Morning.
Morning. Okay, so let's do our meditation. Start coming into the circle. I'm just going to turn off my video while I do that, and I'm just going to point to the grace, the grounding, relaxing, awareness, centering, and energizing without too much speaking too much. So take a few deep breaths. Elongate the spine while you press down through the soles of your feet. And start grounding your energy. Try to feel the energy in your body without forcing or willing it to go down. Just observe and be aware. Connecting your core to the sacred core of the earth. And relax as though you have come home. Become aware of that connection. Become aware of the energy in your body. And become aware of the world around you. Bring your awareness back into the central channel of your body. And center yourself through the 3 energy centers. Energize yourself as a conduit connecting the earth energy to the sky. And inhale and raise your arms. Exhale and bring the energy back into your lower dantian, into your core. And come back into the circle we've formed and slowly open your eyes. Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna go back into Spivak and try to focus on that on the passages that I emailed to you. But before I jump into that, are there any questions or comments on other passages before we sort of just get into that? And okay. So I'm trying to, these passages that I selected are all around the construction of the figure of Sati. And while I'm looking at that, I'm starting off with the first, turning to the first one, page 53, and it's 79 for the PDF. 78 and 79 for the PDF. Starts on 78. So she goes into the scriptures of trying to explain what sati is, whether it is actually sanctioned through the scriptures, through the Sanskrit scriptures. And so she points out that sanctioned suicide, what she's calling sanctioned suicide, is an exception to the rule, right? So sati is always an exception to all suicide, self-immolation, sacrifice, in the sense of giving your life over, is an exception to the rule. It's not sanctioned through scripture. Sati is not sanctioned through scripture as a norm, as something that widows need to do. and she goes through all of these categories of sanctioned suicide or sacrifice, right? And it's really interesting. The first category that she points towards, the first category arises out of tattva janana, or the knowledge of right principles. So I'm just going to read in the middle of that paragraph that starts the two moments in the...
It's Vyagnya. Tattva Vyagnya.
Tattva
Vyagnya.
Thank you. Tattva Vyagnya. So Tattva Vyagnya, she says, arises out of the knowledge of right principles. Here, the knowing subject comprehends the insubstantiality of mere phenomenality, which may be the same as non-phenomenality, of its identity. At a certain point in time, tattva was interpreted as that you, but even without that, tattva is thatness or quiddity. Quiddity meaning the essential nature of yourself, right? So it's when you realize that you are willingly sacrificing that ego identity, thatness of you, not the essence of you, that's when that first form of sacrifice, or the killing of the self, is sanctioned through scripture, right? So it's actually the killing of the ego self, not the essential self, right? Thatness, the identity of you. So that's the first form. And then she goes into the second form, which is the self-sacrifice of the gods. And that really interestingly is, she associates with ecological sanction, bringing back a balance in the ecology of the world. The gods self-sacrifice themselves for ecological balance. And then the third form is in going to a place of pilgrimage. So it's it's outside yourself. The first form is within yourself, your identity, but the second form is through ritual in place of pilgrimage, right? But the women's the sati is none of these categories, even in scripture, right? So that's a very interesting, like at the bottom of that whole page, she says, yet even this is not the proper place for the woman to annul the proper name of suicide through the destruction of her proper self. For her alone is sanctioned self-immolation on a dead spouse's pyre. Her enlightenment, and she goes into that on the second page, the next page. For me, it's the next page. For you guys, it's still page 79. Is that a similar sanction for men is accorded when a devotee sacrifices himself on the master's pyre, right? So it is similar to that kind of. So it has the master disciple relationship, a relationship of hierarchy. And so the woman can only, so the woman can only, on the next page, she says, this suicide that is not suicide may be read as a simulacrum of both truth knowledge and piety of place. If the former, it is as if the knowledge in a subject of its own insubstantiality and mere phenomenality is dramatized so that the dead husband becomes the exteriorized example and place of the extinguished subject, and the widow becomes the not agent who acts it out. The logical consequence of placing agency in alterity. So the agency, the woman's agency is placed in her husband, right? Through we've already sort of discussed that. And so even her form of sacrifice is not for her liberation from the cycle of birth and death, her enlightenment is also dependent upon her husband, right? So this is not in this passage, but she says that in another place where the cycle, the woman, the sati, essentially liberates herself from the cycle of death and rebirth. So she becomes enlightened, right? So in a similar fashion as most martyrs are considered, right? They're considered enlightened beings. They sacrifice for this greater purpose or for a greater truth, let's say. But for the woman, it's dependent still, even in scripture, upon the body of her husband, right? So so that's kind of the very kind of crucial. But it is an exception, right? So it's an exception in very certain exceptional circumstances. But the way in which colonial historiography created the idea of sati was that they said, no, this is codified in Hindu law. So they relegate it to a culturally relative position, right? They say, no, this is Hindu law, but now we're going to pronounce this as a crime. And so colonial historiography produces sati as a crime, but still says this is the correct interpretation of Hindu laws. And then the nativist, the local patriarchal, sort of the Brahmanical kind of interpretation is, yes, this is also part of Hindu law, and the woman is choosing to do that for herself, right? So they are willing to die. But in both of these constructions, we don't hear the voice of the woman. We don't see the consciousness of the woman. What is her position? That both these discourses are sort of reinforcing that patriarchal kind of norm, right? Even despite the fact that it's not sanctioned through scripture, and these are very exceptional kind of circumstances, yet they create and codify. Essentially, they create the figure of the sati as this place of contestation, right? So the colonial can say, no, this is barbaric, and we need to declare it into a crime. But if they look at it through the lens of cultural relativism, right? And so I think I had another passage. Let's look at that, where she sort of parallels on the next page, my page 56 and your page 82 and 83, where she has the quote from Thompson, who is describing this as a horrible human offense, like nothing comparable to witch burnings or any of those things, right? And then right after the quote, there's a very decisive no with a full stop. No, this is not the case, right? As in the case of war, martyrdom, terrorism, self-sacrifice is general. The felicitous sati may have been imagined to have thought she was exceeding and transcending the ethical. That is its danger. Not all soldiers die unwillingly, and there are female suicide bombers. So she's drawing the connection between the idea of sacrifice and how do you distinguish the sacrifice of a soldier willing to die, of a suicide bomber willing to die for its cause, of Sati if she is willing to die for her belief. But how do you distinguish these forms of sacrifice, right, that exceed the ethical? And that's, I think, really crucially important, this phenomena of the exception to the ethical, right? And so can we actually look at the idea of nonviolence as a form also of suffering and sacrifice through the lens of the ethical, or does that also exceed the ethical, right? So just keep that sort of in mind, and I just want to tie it in with the Gandhi passage that she before I open it up to your questions and discussion. So on the next page, my 57 and your 83 to 84. And the passage that starts that this was an alternative ideology of the graded sanctioning of varieties of suicide as exception rather than its inscription as sin was of course not understood. Sati could not of course be read with Christian female martyrdom and the defunct husband standing in for the transcendental other, right? So the parallel is not being made through colonial historiography between Christian female martyrdom dying for her God and Sati dying for her husband, right? That parallel is not being made in colonial historiography. Or the soldier, or with war, with the husband standing in for the sovereign state, for whose sake an intoxicating ideology of self-sacrifice can be mobilized, right? So in times of war, it's a similar kind of thing, right? You're dying, you're willing to die, sacrifice yourself, your body for your nation, right? So is that a similar kind of parallel that we need to draw? But suicide as exception, I'm going to go down now a few sentences down in the same paragraph, where it starts, the only related transformation was Mahatma Gandhi's reinscription of the notion of satyagraha, or hunger strike, as resistance. But this is not the place to discuss the details of that sea change. I would merely invite the reader to compare the auras of widow sacrifice and Gandhian resistance. The root of the first part of Satyagraha and Sati are the same. So is this suicide through exception? And of course, she doesn't understand the full meaning of satyagraha here, right? So it's just, for her, it's just hunger strike. And that is something that happens even in the subaltern studies historian accounts of resistance, of Indian South Asian resistance movements, that all resistance movements in their analysis are violent resistances. They don't give an account of Gandhi through the lens of the subaltern, of a grassroots form of resistance. And that's a huge sort of gap in scholarship. It's now slowly being addressed. Now people are sort of trying to look at and understand Gandhi on his own terms. But at this point in writing, and through many of the subaltern studies historians, you will not, they have no analysis of, they have no understanding of Gandhi's nonviolence. And I'm going to suggest that that's sort of the way out of this kind of whole dilemma that she set up, is the fact that she is sketching out really in great detail the dominant framework, how this framework has become our narrative of reality, the normative narrative of reality. She's sketching out all of sort of the contours of it, but she doesn't have a way out of it. And she doesn't have an understanding of what satyagraha means, right? It's not just hunger strike, right? That's not, she's limited to that. And of course she says, well, this is not the place to discuss it, because she really doesn't know how to discuss it. And so I think that this is, in a sense, a pointer. If we're looking at silences, so her silence and the subaltern studies historian silences in trying to understand nonviolence resistance, their silence is also pointing to something else, right? So a different cosmology that cannot be read through their framework of interpretation, right? Through this dominant, because they're sketching out the dominant framework, right? And they have a very Marxist analysis, beautifully to understand the present system, no doubt. But they cannot grasp it because that is also a pointer to a different cosmology, a different framework of understanding, right? Nonviolence is that. It's positing a different framework. It's not just deconstructing the present violent framework the way she is. We are positing an alternative to it, and it cannot be read. Those kinds of resistances, the nonviolent, cannot be fully read because we're still looking at it through the dominant framework. It cannot be read through that. It's not legible through that. And so I'm just going to finish off with her, the last passage. It's on page 60 and page 88 for you guys, at the bottom of page 88. And then the meaning of Sat. This is the paragraph that starts, I think it's the third paragraph for you guys. I have written above of a constructed counter-narrative of women's consciousness, thus women's being good, thus the good woman's desire, thus woman's desire. This slippage can be seen in the fracture inscribed in the very word sati, the feminine form of Sat. Sat transcends any gender-specific notion of masculinity and moves up not only into human, but spiritual universality. It is the present participle of the verb to be, and as such means not only being, but the true, the good, the right. In the sacred text, it is essence, universal spirit. Even as a prefix, it indicates appropriate, felicitous fit. It is noble enough to have entered the most privileged discourse. So on, I'll just end with that. So the meaning of sati is actually pointing to your beingness, right? The truth of your beingness, the truth of yourself. And that's what Gandhi was trying to say when he said satyagraha is a holding on to truth, right? So satyagraha is a holding on. It's a holding on to the truth of your being, of the truth of your essence. And so I just wanted to, and she does, like, you know, she goes into it really well in that sort of unpacking that word sat and the connection with satyagraha, and with sati as the female form of that. So I will stop there and open it up to your questions and comments and discussions. I know I threw a lot of stuff at you, but I wanted to just like quickly get speak back out before I lose my train of thought. But what did you think about? Let's start with a specific question to sort of narrow it down. Sort of the idea of sanctioned suicide, either through violence or non-violence, as a transcendence of the ethical, as a category outside the ethical. What is non-violence? Is Gandhi's satyagraha positioned within the ethical in contradistinction to violent forms of suicide? Is it, or is there, or is it very similar? And it's, yeah, Ayatakshi.
I think the only thing that comes to my mind right now is the forced practice and out of volition. So my understanding so far makes me think that if it is out of volition, I think there is no wrong in it, because there are parallels of women terrorism and other things, and also and how the Western literature has been imposed on us. Even I am part of it, because the history books and all are contorted version of what the reality is. So there are many loopholes in that way. So to answer your question, I feel one is volition and one is forced. So forced is a problem. I think that is not non-violence, as per what I understand by Gandhian philosophy of non-violence. But the other, I think that is absolutely okay if it is done out of your choice. Yeah.
But a lot of suicide bombers, I would sort of continue that. A lot of suicide bombers do it out of choice too, to sacrifice themselves. They're willing to do that because of their whatever belief system, for their nation, for a lot of martyrs. Yeah, so you can, yeah, so choice can come work both ways, I think. Kim?
I think, I don't know, I may be totally off, but when you asked that question, it reminded me of bringing, I think when Ghaffar Khan was trying to unite, the people and ending feuds, and I went into the other reading, but to bring the weapons to your so-called enemy, in a way, to say, this is what I'm willing to do for justice, and to end injustice and exploitation. I don't know, for me, that just kind of, they kind of, anyway, that just came to mind. And so that there's, yeah, anyway, sorry, that's an unfinished thought.
That's great. No, that's great. Yeah. Unfinished thoughts are good as well. I think that's what we're all trying to do. I mean, my thought is, I'm trying to grapple with this as much as, but I think this is sort of the key. I'm not clear on it yet. That's why I want to discuss it as the ethical component, right? So, Elizabeth?
I too, Kim and Sephora, have plenty of unfinished thoughts. So I'm glad that that's not a requirement to be able to speak in this class. One of the things that differentiates, to me, the suicide bomber, not necessarily the choice aspect, but the whole aspect of Gandhi and means and ends. And so if you are trying to eradicate an injustice, you can't eradicate an injustice using violence if you're trying to have nonviolent means. So the means and the ends, I think Gandhi said, have to be controvertible, or the means have to be in the ends and the ends have to be in the means, that can be interchangeable. So that for me is the difference between those who would choose to perpetuate violence in order to bring about justice.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great point. That's really a great point. The means and ends argument. But I'm going to be difficult and keep prodding, and is not to discount any of what you are saying, just to sort of clarify the position, right, for all of us, is that these are nevertheless sacrifice and suicide, even self-suffering, the passage that we read in Fernandez from Martin Luther King of self-suffering, the difference between violence and non-violence is the ability to self-suffer versus making others suffer. Is that there is a certain violence that you're doing to yourself as well, right? Through sacrifice.
Right. Yes.
So how is that then a good means to an end where you don't want the violence? Anne?
Well, you just brought in another element. So there's so many elements, my brain is spinning, I must say. But I wanted to say something about the transformation of the self. And also I wanted to say something about sati being the feminine form of being. So I don't know where that's going to land, but I feel like there's something in there that I would like to consider.
Yes.
And it's not formed, of course.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is like what Elizabeth is saying. I think that's crucially important. I think all of you are we're bringing in like little components. And so we need to like, these little components create the bigger, the more stronger kind of picture for our own clarity. Is the idea of the essence, right? This idea of sat, of the truth of ourselves. And how perhaps in seeing this truth of ourselves, seeing this this idea of self-transformation leading to an enlightenment, that moment. And by enlightenment, I mean, as in the mystical tradition of like connecting with the sacred. You let go of your ego identity enough that you can connect with the sacred, right? So that can be a momentary form of enlightenment, or, more people who are perhaps more well-versed at that process have a longer kind of connection with the sacred, and it speaks through them almost, right? Because they've let go of. So that if that is your essential being, right? If that is your essence, that is your true self, that you're trying to see through the process of self-transformation, through the process of meditation. And then so when you see that vision, that sort of that, or experience it in your body, that feeling, which I think is not a feeling of suffering, but of great joy. I think Brad sort of pointed us to that in his article that he sent out, and that great intense joy and bliss that you get out of it. And a lot of literature describes enlightenment as this process of bliss, right? So when you have that kind of experience and feeling, nothing less will do. And then you can then you're willing to say, well, if you're offering me something less, it's almost like a compromise, and I'm willing to die for this picture that I know to be true, that I know to be right, that I know I can feel in myself, that is my potential. It is the potential of this earth. And so I'm sort of trying to connect all of you. Brad? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I'm thinking thoughts that are perhaps a bit disconnected from the main sort of conversation that we're having here in the main question, but I think it relates, and so allow me some room. But as the course is alternative cosmologies, and we are talking about death. But I'm wondering if some part of this speaks to something that happens beyond death, and if we are looking at it merely in this lifetime, in this time frame, right? And the reason that I say that is you know, one cosmology that I have been steeped in is that of Christianity, and so I think of Christ going to the cross and the self-sacrifice there, and there's a lot of theological discussion that we could have, whether that was forced or voluntary or what, but I know that it was out of love, right? And so it was, you know, a giving of the self. And something else that I'm thinking that sort of relates to that paper on Buddhism is like, for example, the Aboriginals and many other indigenous peoples speak of us being like in a dream time, you know, and so when I think along these lines, I'm saying, well, perhaps this isn't the real reality, right? Perhaps there is a different reality beyond this, and perhaps this is a dream, perhaps this is suffering, and just to kind of bring this together, and I may have just lost it in my mind, but I was thinking that like perhaps there is something that happens like in this transformation that like that we can't like clearly see. So I don't know. I was going to say more, and if it comes back to me, I'll revisit this. But I just kind of wanted to throw that out for the moment.
Right, great, thank you. Yeah, no, thanks very much. Yeah, it is. I mean, we are looking at it through the lens of Christ's sacrifice, right? That's sort of the Christian idea of sacrifice as redemption. And Martin Luther King, you know, has that whole discourse. Even Gandhi was very heavily influenced by that, right? So that is part of that discourse. So it's good that you bring it in. I mean, these are all examples of, and I think that is another element that we should add to our, you know, sort of trying to understand. Love is a crucial element in all of this, right? So the nonviolent, the sacrifice through nonviolence is done through love, right? But I'm trying to say that the love is also of the self, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think we sort of discount that. We don't feel like we're worthy of that kind of love, and suffering is sort of the only norm that we seem to accept very willingly. But that compassion has to be extended to ourselves first. The love has to be extended to ourselves first, in order for us to then, you know, manifest it outside. I think Ayatakshi, you had your hand up first, and then Kim. I'm not sure which way around it was, but go ahead, Ayatakshi, and then Kim.
Yeah, I had, as and when I'm reading the literature, these several instances are just coming into my mind, and if it is not framed properly, so please pardon me. But I had a similar thought about about Christ's crucifixion, and thanks, Brad, for bringing this up, because even I had this example running in my mind. So what can that be? Because if means are equally important as ends, then isn't that a self-harming tendency of not protesting? So can that be categorized as violence or non-violence? I mean, I don't know. I'm unsure about that.
Yeah, I think that's what we're
So
trying to grapple with, right? Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, that's what we're trying to grapple with, is the, you know, the component of self-sacrifice with the harm, different from the sacrifice that harms others. Kaka, Amelia? Oh, sorry, Kim was first. I think Kim was first. Yeah.
This is kind of another partial little bit, and I think I may be taking us out of you know, the kind of theoretical realm, but into kind of a more micro practical level. But I do transformative mediation, and not meditation, mediation. And one of the things that we talk about is you know, we have people in conflict, and one of the things that keeps us in conflict is this mode of self-protection. And then what can arise when you come out of this mode of self-protection and kind of liberate yourself from this mode of self-protection in order to see the other. And yeah, I just wanted to kind of throw that in there. And I don't know if that, you know,
Yeah, no, thank you. That's great. I think Kara had something similar when you were saying something similar when you were talking about, correct me if I'm wrong and I'm I'm not saying it correctly, Kara, but you were saying, I think you see, well, the source of suffering, the source of violence comes from people's suffering, but when you can see the suffering, when you can see that in somebody's eyes, when they are in the midst of perpetrating horrible violence, that sort of liberates you in a sense. I'm not sure if that even connects with Kim, but it sort of came to my mind. But I let Kaka speak, and then we'll see if we can make the connections.
Hi, I guess I will repeat a little bit of what Brad and Kim said in their introductions, because maybe what I am going to say will go a little bit out of the main topic around violence against others or against oneself, or harm against others or against oneself, and sacrifice and all this topic. I just wanted to thank you so much, Safora, because it was very important to me to listen to someone pointing that topic around Spivak critique, like what she and many of the subaltern studies authors were not also seeing, because for me, listening to that was very important, because it really made sense. Like, oh yeah, they were not seeing that in that moment, at least, or they were not acknowledging that, or and it's something that it makes sense to me, and at the same time it's very hard to me to say something like that here where I am, because the feeling that I have, and I feel always very divided, inner divided, because it seems that when I'm in more inside the social movements and pointing to nonviolence, it's easily understood, and I understand that. I can comprehend, but it's easily understood as a kind of giving up the struggle, or giving up our dream, or giving up the better world we want, because nonviolence is, at least here in the city I live, in the places I am more part of, it's still more understood as a kind of, how can I say that, as a kind of weakness, and coward, something coward, and something like you are giving up, and you are like submitting yourself to the violence and to the power of others. And so I just wanted to thank for that, but I acknowledge I totally turned to another direction. Sorry for that.
No, it's not at all. Actually, that's sort of why I'm trying to clarify the idea of suffering, so for ourselves, so we can actually articulate it to others. And yes, nonviolence is not understood. and it's understood as a form of pacifism, right? That's the English term. That generally, pacifism is you just give up and you're sort of nonviolent in that sense, right? It's not understood as a fight, as a very powerful form of resistance, right? Requiring much more force than violence, right? And we're sort of as usual running out of time, but when we get to the history that I'm going to present to you today, that's, I think, becomes more and more clearer. So I thank you for pointing that out, and that's exactly why we need the clarity for ourselves on the idea of suffering, because I think a lot of people, not only do they not understand the framework of nonviolence as an alternate framework, and I think that needs to be really clarified amongst ourselves, that it is an alternate cosmology. We are pointing to an alternate cosmology when we are saying nonviolence. We're not just saying no to this one, right? We're not just saying no to nonviolence. It's not just the negation of that. It's not a deconstruction of that. We're actually, we have another framework which we want to posit in its place. So that's very important and crucial. But this idea of suffering, I think sacrifice puts a lot of people off. Like, oh, that's what we need to do, is just to go out there and become like, human shields. Because nonviolence is just considered civil disobedience, right? Even Spivak is just talking about the hunger strike, not as a different epistemological framework altogether. So it's just understood on these physical levels of you go out and you practice boycotts and all of, do the strike and all of those things. And there, of course, the picture of Gandhi going on hunger strike, or people getting killed, for their in these boycotts, has become so huge in popular representation. And so, why we need to be clear on why is there a need for that? Where does that that clarity needs to come from within us, as to we're seeing something so much more valuable. Similar to the soldier, right? But we're similar to the soldier and the martyr and all of those. They're seeing something so much more valuable, a truth, that they're willing to sacrifice their bodies for it. But we're trying to then also distinguish ourselves from that, right? From the suicide bomber, who's also seeing great value in what, towards his or her end. And so that's sort of what we're trying to grapple with. Kara?
Oh, can you hear me? Oh,
Yes.
yeah. Well, the phrase that came to mind as we're talking about this, and I so love this discussion, is from Paul Tillich.
Mm-hmm.
His book, now I forgot the title, but he says non-being drives being out of its seclusion. Non-being drives being out of its seclusion. And I guess I mention it now because I feel like what we're talking about is if one puts oneself in a context of suffering, you choose it, but you choose it not out of a strategic, controlled position. One chooses it out of this idea of the essence is not the essence is love. The essence is in relationship. It's in relationship with oneself, the people one's interacting with, in relationship maybe the group that you're involved with. So we're in relationship, acting out of the deepest sense of an emotional giving with a larger view of oneness. And I think and the word control came into my mind, that one has to give up control, strategic control of what exactly will happen. It has to be, but I'm not saying it's just willy-nilly, but right. I guess I'm trying to say that I feel like the being that comes, the being shut down, being oppressed, being controlled, being all these things, all this violence, that pushes out of us the desire for the freedom, for the love, for the life. And then you put that on the table in some moving situation that, you know, that's the cosmology there, that you put yourself out there, not knowing exactly, you do your best guess, but not knowing, and that you have to somehow respond still. I don't know. It just seems to me that it seems like it's in those moments that one gives beyond, and then one gets a clarity, and one's, oh, you see the bigger relationship. Oh, wow, that guy is just like me. Somehow that those kinds of enlightenment moment and the joy that comes with that, it only comes in this kind of, it's a long chain of internal, external, physical. But so I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think you're really, I think we're sort of really honing in really well now. I think the idea of going back to identities and how they're formed, and ideologies and power structures that form our identities, I think that's part of this, right? You are the idea of sacrifice or the suffering is not being imposed upon you through an ideological framework or through some kind of power structure, because that in itself is perpetrating the violence, right? You're recycling the violence of that power structure or the ideology that has created these kinds of forms of reaction. I think we're getting sort of close to it. I'm still not like fully cannot articulate it, but I think what you're saying in this kind of Kara, in the idea of sort of an organic, we don't quite know, you know, going back to Lila Fernandez, it's actually, we should be in that place of not knowing and not having this clear. And even for nonviolence, I think even for nonviolence, that is a danger, right? We turn nonviolence into an absolutist ideology, and maybe even Gandhi into an idol, or any of the leaders. And just we want to sort of follow that along rather than internally knowing the truth for ourselves, right? So so can the place of that internal transformation or enlightenment, or can that be the place of action rather than imposed from outside through ideological, or even the best of ideologies is kind of a form of power and domination, right, upon you. So maybe that's sort of the next kind of and Brad, did you have your hand up again, or was it up from before? I'm not sure.
I did. I mean, we're talking about a lot of it, so I can share more, but in the interest of time, if there's other stuff that you want to move on to, that's okay as well. Yeah.
Okay, Kim?
Sorry, I'm talking a lot today, but I'm just.
No, please.
But I mean, yes, this idea of nonviolence as like as an alternate cosmology. I mean, for me, and I think I've said this before early on in the class, is that I think the prison abolition movement places nonviolence in the world as a practical application, right? And like that, for me, that's where that happens, is recognizing, pointing to that interdependency, pointing to that, yeah, anyways, that radicalness of, or the radicality of nonviolence, as well as the, yeah, anyway, I don't know where I was going with that, but yeah.
Right, great. Yeah, no, radicality of nonviolence. We definitely need, that's a good place to, let's move into the Khudayi Khidmat Gar, because I think that was a very radically nonviolent movement. So I'm just gonna just be back in 1 minute. I just take a quick break, and I'll be back in a minute, and then I'll share my slides with you.
Safora? I guess she's out. Does anyone can teach me how to to pronounce correctly the I don't know how to say the name of this other movement that is the topic of the class today. Slowly.
You mean Khudai Kidmatgar? That's the one.
Yeah. Can you
Khudai
finish?
Kidmatgar.
Kudai Kidmatgar.
Yes.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you, Ayatakshi.
I think that Sephora pronounces it more with the H, like Hudai. I hear in her a little bit.
Yeah, maybe there's different accents. I don't know.
Okay.
She's back. Sephora.
Yes.
Right now I have more questions. just about I would like to say correctly the name of this movement that is the topic of the class today. Ayatakshi generously helped me. Kudai Kidmatgar, but I would like to ask if it's there are different accents or this kind of things, and because Brad remembered maybe you say it in a different way. I don't know.
Yeah, it is a difficult name to pronounce. It's Khudai. So Khudai is God, and Khidmatgar is the servant. So Khudai Khidmatgars, and so the servants of God, essentially. That's what.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So so this was an army, and you can see this is sort of the iconic kind of picture of the Khudai Khidmatgars taken at the height of the movement in 1930s. And you can see the uniforms that they're wearing, very similar to the British colonial army uniforms, but they were dyed a brick red color. And so they were also called by the colonial authorities, they were called the red shirts. And of course, the colonial authorities then sort of categorized them as Bolsheviks, but they had nothing to do with communism or anything for that. They just dyed their uniforms a brick red color because they were made from homespun, from khadi. And the homespun is generally sort of like a buff, a natural buff tan color, and it would get dirty very quickly. So just for practical reasons, they dyed the uniforms in a saddle dye. So the saddle dye sort of brick red color became sort of the norm. And then later on, they were dyed in a brighter red color, artificial pigment. And so that was why the uniforms were red. But you can see in this sort of iconic picture, it's like a massive movement, right? The Khudai Khidmatgar movement. Almost every person in the Northwest Frontier Province, and I'll just explain that designation, the geographic designation of this area in a moment. Almost every family had somebody who belonged to the Khudai Khidmatgar movement. It was that massive. It was a huge, like on a provincial scale, right? So like a whole state, let's say, was participating in this movement. And it was a grassroots movement. And the reason that I'm calling it a subaltern movement is that it was actually generally composed of people in the villages, so the lower level classes, and they were part of the hierarchy of the army. So it was not run by an elite. There was no elitism through your family blood background in how you rise through the ranks of the army. It was led by Abdul Ghaffar Khan, who is you know, you can categorize him as a part of the elite. So he's a big landowning Khan. This is a picture of Abdul Ghaffar Khan. But I'm still categorizing him as subaltern because he has also been marginalized, not only in the sort of the center of the nationalist discourse at that time, even though he was part of the Indian National Congress movement, very close friends with Gandhi. And he was even offered the presidency of the All India National Congress at one point, but he refused it, and Maulana Azad became the president in his place. So he's part of the center, you know, the nationalist movement, very much so. But why I'm still calling him sort of a subaltern figure is that at the crucial time when India and Pakistan, you know, the idea of Pakistan was being formulated, and the Khudai Khatmatgars were so against the idea of the partition of India along religious lines, was that his voice was not heard at all in that kind of resistance to the idea of partition. And here was the largest Muslim majority province that did not want the creation of Pakistan as a Muslim country, right? So it disrupted Pakistani state narratives, that here was the largest Muslim majority province that did not want to be included in Pakistan. And so that is another reason for the silencing of this movement. But I'm going to start off with two other key components of why this movement has been so silenced, after I give you just a brief background of the history in itself. So he's also called Bacha Khan. He's also called the Frontier Gandhi. And the frontier, the Northwest frontier, I'll show you on this map. So here's a map of British India. And on the top northwest corner of it, I don't know if can you see my pointer in that? That border right there, the border next to Afghanistan. So that was the first key border that the colonial government created, right? Not the Bengal border, but the Northwest frontier border, actually, even though there's so much literature about the Bengal border and the partition of Bengal. But this partitioning between Afghanistan and British India through the Durand Line was the first of the borders. And this is a 3-layered border. So Afghanistan was considered one layer in the border as a buffer state against Russian imperialism. And then you had the Durand Line, which divided the Pashtun tribes on both sides, half on the Afghan side and half on that, at that time, British India side. And then you had the Northwest Frontier Province, which was the 3rd layer in the border. So you divide, so then the British divided the tribal territories into a separate zone, which was supposed to be autonomous, that they would follow their own tribal codes, and British rule had no, British rule and laws were not supposed to be applicable to them. But in fact, it created this garrison state in that. So the border between the tribal territories and the Northwest frontier became much more difficult to cross than even the border between British India and Afghanistan. And the reason for that was that they wanted to not only divide the Pashtun people sort of 3 ways because of their constant resistance against imperialism, but it also allowed them in this designation of the lawless tribal area to sort of impose imperial laws upon them without accountability. And that, unfortunately, continues to this day. That colonial law has been taken up by Pakistani state, and the tribal territories continue to be this garrison separate state. So you don't know what is actually going on there. It can be the target of drone strikes. It can be, you know, it can be labeled as a terrorist haven or whatever, and the state can with impunity, send the army in there and so on. So what I'm trying to say by describing these kinds of zones of exception, right, is that that because it was a crucial border territory and still remains a crucial border territory, the state can impose its writ upon that place without accountability, and the people are designated outside the law. So they're designated as an exceptional category of people. Yes, a framework of silencing a people if you designate them outside the law, and that the law can be imposed upon them in any shape or form without any state accountability. And so, so I'm gonna get back to the leadership. So Ghaffar Khan, created the Khuday Khidmatgar movement in 1928, and it was initially created for the social transformation of the Pashtuns. And his emphasis was on reforming Pashtun customs that valorized violence, especially. And so there was these long sort of cycles of enmity where people would take vengeance, and then the other family would, retaliate, and so these long feuds would continue for many generations. And so he wanted to reform that custom, especially, and then he wanted to emancipate women and bring them into the public sphere. And so the segregation of women became hugely important. And then the first thing that he wanted to do was to make education the primary means of transforming Pashtun culture. And by education, he meant a particular kind of education, so not the colonial educational system, but it had to be a vernacular education system as also a form of resistance, as a form of resistance against colonial knowledge systems, right? So that was really crucial in how the change was brought about. And what was really, I think, crucial is to, in understanding how the Khuday Khidmatgars brought about embodied nonviolence, right? So readily that the whole province almost sort of took that up. And within a few years of their formation, it happened. So my question when I started off my research was that the Pashtuns have long been categorized as a very violent race of people, right? As this warrior race by colonial historiography, by Mughal historiography. So even within South Asia, they are regarded as a violent people, right? So before even colonial sort of categories and representations were imposed upon them, they were also identified as a violent warrior race. But then through the creation of these three-layered borders, there was huge resistance against the formation of these three-layered borders. So there was 3 Anglo-Afghan wars that happened after each of the borders, creation of the borders. And after each of those, representations of the Pashtuns in colonial literature becomes more and more denigrating. So the Pashtun becomes more and more violent, and he's a backstabber, and he's a savage, and he's a barbarian. And then slowly you get the addition, especially in the Third Anglo-Afghan War, when Winston Churchill is reporting that to the British public. He's actually in the frontier reporting. Then you get the addition of the Muslim as the barbarian and the savage and as the warrior, right? So all of these representations, if we can remember sort of Spivak's 2 formulations of representation, right? The figuration of a people, representation in that sense, is being formulated without the context of why they're rebelling, why they're resisting. Without that context, it's just an essentialized racial marker. right? The Pashtuns are a violent people. And then Islam is an added thing, right? So all the baggage of Islam is added onto that representation. While the colonial literature is representing and speaking on their behalf, right? So the two forms of representation, it's also speaking on their behalf, that these are a people that are a violent people, and it's creating the figure of the Pashtun as a violent figure, right? So when such a huge nonviolent movement comes along, it's not even recognized. It's not legible in that framework. Like, how can the Pashtun become nonviolent, right? He's not supposed to be. He's supposed to be violent. He's not supposed to be nonviolent. That whole framework just discloses, the legitimacy of their nonviolence, even though they kept saying that the transformation is an inner transformation. It's not. We're not just taking it on for tactical reasons or for strategic reasons. But in this photograph, you'll see that Gandhi visited the Northwest Frontier Province twice. And each time he would very closely question the Khodai Khidmatgar to see if they were authentically nonviolent, right? So that suspicion of the Pashtuns not being authentically nonviolent was even, like I said, part of the bigger Indian nationalist discourse. So this is a beautiful historical picture of Gandhi visiting the Northwest Frontier Province, and you see Ghaffar Khan next to him. And the reason for his title, the Frontier Gandhi, is now, you understand, because of the geographical name of the province. But in order to make his idea of nonviolence legible, he has to be named a Gandhi, right? Then you create legibility for his nonviolence. So he becomes a Frontier Gandhi. Then you understand Pashtun nonviolence as somebody who is just following Gandhi, you don't understand nonviolence on its own, their nonviolence on its own terms, but just as that marker. And so, yes, so I want to sort of outline the many, in my investigation, when I was trying to investigate this whole, explore how is it that the Pashtuns embodied nonviolence so easily, so readily, how they transformed just within a few years. They grew from a very small, a handful of people to this picture, this iconic picture in the 1930s. From 1928 to 1930, it became this huge province-wide movement. And then it became also a decolonial resistance movement. There was an incident in 1930 in Peshawar, in the old city of Peshawar, in a bazaar called the Kisakhani Bazaar. The name means the street of the storytellers. And this is a very narrow market in the old city of Peshawar. And there were a handful of Khodai Khidmatgars, along with other Congress people and other nationalist movements, protesting against the arrest of Ghaffar Khan and other nationalist leaders for a particular kind of law that had been passed at that time. And the colonial authorities sort of brought in the army, armored tanks, and to police what they were saying was a violent mob. And in this sort of confusion of, like, were they being violent or were they being nonviolent, the colonial authorities opened fire upon the crowd. And they killed a lot of people because it was a very narrow bazaar, right? So if you start opening fire in such a narrow confined area, you will kill a lot of people. And after that, it was called the Peshawar riots. There was 1 year of martial law imposed upon the whole province. And the colonial authorities were really brutal in their policing of any Khodai Khidmatgar. Because first of all, it disrupted their whole idea of the Pashtun as a warrior. So how dare you, in fact, become a nonviolent, right? If we sort of connected to that formation of the other defining you, the violent Pashtun could define the heroic colonial officer serving on these treacherous border zones so much better, right? So you need that violent Pashtun in order to define yourself and justify your violence. A non-violent Pashtun, on the other hand, the colonial authorities didn't know how to deal with that non-violent Pashtun, right? So they really brutally suppressed this movement and tortured the bodies of the Khudai Khidmatgar in a way to represent non-violence as effeminate, right? So the Pashtun has become now effeminate. He's no longer this masculine, virile warrior. By taking on non-violence, he's become effeminate. So let's inscribe that on his body. So literally the torture was done that way to demonstrate that the Pashtun has now become effeminate, right? So it was a very sort of gendered representation of both the violent Pashtun and then the non-violent Pashtun. But what happened in this year long of like repression in the province and martial law and so on was the colonial authorities would come to the villages and do very sort of public humiliation of the Khudai Khidmatgars in front of the other villagers, even in front of their women. They would sort of disrobe them and, perform all kinds of torture on their bodies to denote that they've become effeminized. But what would happen would be that there would be like 3 or 4 people who would step up in witnessing that. They would step up and sign on to become Khudai Khidmatgars. So the repression actually created this huge movement. So everybody in the province, and then it became an anti-colonial resistance movement, and they joined the All India Congress Committee and became representatives of the All India National Congress in the province. And they formed, when the elections were held, they won the elections 3 times and through popular mandate to form the government in that province. But what I'm trying to sort of then get at is that how is it, the ways to understand how they embodied nonviolence in the midst of all of this, their own sort of valorizations of violence, and then the colonial representations of violence upon them. How is it that they embraced nonviolence so readily that even today, there's a beautiful book that's been written by Mukhaliki Banerjee. It's called The Pathan Unarmed. She went and interviewed the remaining Khudai Khidmatgars. It was written in the 1990s, I think. So the Khudai Khidmatgars that remained, she interviewed them, and she wanted to know about the history, and they would inevitably articulate their name. They would say their name, and then they would add Khudai Khidmatgar to it, right? So that was a part of their identity, that they were Khudai Khidmatgars, and that remained even after brutal repression from Pakistani state. They had their uniform still, and they would just break down and start crying, saying that everybody has forgotten about us, but we haven't forgotten, why we became nonviolent. In the first place, it wasn't done for tactical reasons. We are still, we're still embodying that way of being. So what I want to point out to you is that the many layers in which they embodied nonviolence. So one was obviously the physical level. They became an army, and they had training camps and to discipline them, and much like the Martin Luther King sort of, the Kingian training on how to be nonviolent in rallies and in dire situations where you're being policed and in the midst of violence, in the midst of physical violence. So they had all those training camps at that time. So one of the first sort of peacekeeping armies, if you will, right, in history. But then they had these other layers, and I think they are very crucially important to understand, is that they had the whole idea of education. So they opened up schools in the vernacular, and the schools were both for women and for for girls and for boys. And the whole idea of transforming themselves, their subjectivity through education became really crucial. And then they had, which was a huge component of this movement, they had a journal called, also called the Pakhtun. And the journal contained a lot of poetry and a lot of news. It was like a newsletter of the history of the Pashtuns, but also a newsletter about what's happening in the present contemporary era, and trying to grapple with and understand nonviolence through discursive means, right? So through the idea of the ideas of nonviolence were being discussed, but the poetry. But this allowed the women Khuday Khidmatgar to contribute in a huge numbers so they could remain sort of veiled in their homes, but they would be writing and contributing in the Pakhtun journal. They would sometimes also attend rallies. So if there was a big rally like this one, there would be a segregated portion for the women also to attend the rallies, and they could also ask questions. They would send, one of the children to Ghafar Khan or whoever the speaker was with their questions. So they would participate, but much more, on physical level, they were much smaller community. But on the discursive and the literary level, there was a huge contribution of women to this movement. And I'll go into the women's literature next time. But today I want to focus on a poet that is very famous Pashtun poet called Ghani Khan. And he is the son of Ghafar Khan. That's Ghani Khan. So he's a very famous poet in his own right. And he writes very little about nonviolence, but he has one poem called Nonviolence, which I shared with you, and one poem called Bacha Khan's March on Marzan. And I want to look at those very closely so that we can understand how the imaginary was changed, right? How the imaginary was changed while still being embedded within their culture. So this wasn't a Gandhian nonviolence, sort of just taken on from Gandhi and you sort of translate it into your own language. It wasn't that at all, right? So it's like you're very culturally embedded and you're pointing to the nonviolent codes that are within your culture that perhaps have been marginalized and are no longer visible. And his poetry does that really well. So I'm gonna just, we are out of time already. Okay. So I don't know if you guys can stay on, or should I pick up next time? What's sort of the consensus?
I'd like to stay.
I can stay.
Okay, we'll do a few minutes, and it's being recorded, so in case you need to jump off, I'll just do one poem and then I'll get to the other poems. We'll just jump right into the poems next time. Okay, so. So this is from the poem Nonviolence that I've shared with you. And I think this is the, I think it's the third or maybe the fourth couplet in the poem. If you have the poem with you, you can look at your own version, but this one. So I'm going to start with this as to how Ghani Khan, the poet, is explaining nonviolence through their own cultural terms, right? So the first verse is, mothers place Qurans on their heads. Once again, sisters have blackened their eyes. So amongst the Pashtuns, there is this, the code of Pashtun Wali, or how to live as a Pashtun. And these codes are juridical as well as social and political ways of organizing their communities. And they still operate within the tribal territories. That's why the British said, well, they can operate within their Pashtun Wali codes. We don't have to impose laws upon them, the British laws upon them. And so, but then they didn't recognize them as laws. They didn't recognize Pashtun Wali as a code of conduct or organizing principle that organizes communities on many levels. They would continue to categorize them as lawless people. But in the Pashtun Wali codes, there is one code that they are very famous for, and that is the code of Badal, right? So that in a lot of representations of the Pashtuns, that gets translated as revenge and retribution because of that idea of taking vengeance if you have been wronged. And because you don't have policing systems, right? You are policing yourself. There is a whole framework, there's a whole code in which that method of retribution is justified. So it's not just that you can pick up a gun and you go shoot somebody, the way it's represented, but there's a whole system in which that operates as to how you bring justice about. It's essentially a form of local tribal forms of justice, right? Encoding justice. But that idea of Badal as retribution and revenge, through the categorizations of the Pashtuns as a violent race, has become the dominant kind of form of representation in all anthropological and ethnographic and even colonial literature. That is the code that is presented as the Pashtun code, that defines the Pashtun Badal. So Ghani Khan in this, when he says mothers place Qurans on their heads once again, is pointing to another code that is known amongst the Pashtun tribes, of course, but not known outside it, and that's called Nanawati. And the code of Nanawati is essentially means to forgive, to reconcile with your enemies, and to open ways of dialogue. How do you go into dialogue with your enemy? And the way in which the Pashtuns would declare that they want to engage in Nanawati, and Nanawati, the literal translation of Nanawati is to enter in. So the ways in which you declare that is that the mother of one of the feuding households will put a Quran on her head and she will go to the enemy's household to declare her sincerity in opening the way to reconciliation and forgiveness and so on. And the enemy household is obliged to let her in because she has come bearing the Quran on her head, right? So here Ghani Khan is pointing to the fact that this is part of our code, right? Nonviolence, this idea of reconciliation and forgiveness. Mothers place the Qurans on their heads once again, right? So once again, we are now bringing this code into the limelight, if you will, right? So into the limelight, the Badal code is being sidelined, but this is pointing to both Badal and Nanawati, right? So it's pointing to that because it is only in a cycle of Badal that you want the Nanawati, you want the reconciliation. But the Badal is being sort of, is a lesser code now. This is once again coming to the foreground. And sisters have blackened their eyes means that, the girls in the households are adorning themselves. They're no longer in mourning, right? They're not mourning for the death of their brothers or sons or fathers or so on. You only adorn your eyes, with kajal or something if you are celebrating. So the sisters are now celebrating perhaps their own weddings, finding suitors in the enemy's household, or just, it is a time of celebration now, right? It's a time of celebration and you adorn your eyes. So once again, sisters are blackening their eyes, and once again, this is happening. And then the second couplet, Baba's Pushtun vision told them tales of another kind. So Baba here is in a reference to Ghafar Khan, both as his father. So Baba is like a title for your father, but also Baba as an honorary figure. You give that title to an honorary elder figure also. So Ghafar Khan's vision, his vision of nonviolence is very much Pushtun. So it's situated in his tradition, his vision is Pakhtun, but he's telling them tales of another kind. So he's telling them a new story, essentially, right? So he's changing the modes of interpretation, but from within the culture. You can't do it from outside. You can't impose something upon a people from outside and expect them to embody it, right? You have to do it from within the framework in which you are, within the context in which you are. Nonviolence was viewed by the Pashtuns, and why it was embodied so readily, because they recognized it amongst their part of their tradition, right? Part of the way of living, but it's just not acknowledged that way. It's not given that emphasis. And so I'll pick up with the next two couplets, which really is speaking about love in this, right? So, and mystical enlightenment. So he brings in mystical enlightenment and love as part of the political recreation through nonviolence. So just take a look at that poem again, and then we'll pick up from here next time. So any thoughts or responses before we, Kara, did you have your hand up? I'm sorry, I just saw that.
No, I'm sorry.
No, I think, okay.
Left it up, but thank you. Just thank you. Wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Okay. Ayataxi?
I have three questions, but I don't know, due to the interest of time, if I may ask. But I am like kind of eager to ask this question, like if Khudai Khidmatkars, since they have joined INC, which is a Hindu dominated political party, and not the Muslim League, which is the Muslim dominated party. So how Ghaffar Khan was perceived as a person, and why he didn't join the Muslim League and rather he joined the INC. So that is a question. And the second question is, like, we can take it in the next class, but where the Pathans, like the entire people, the Khudai Khidmatgars, were they kind of people who were more loyal to the leader rather than to the principle nonviolence, rather than to the philosophy of nonviolence, is my question. Because somewhere I read that the movement was silenced also because people thought that they are more loyal to the leader rather than to the principle of nonviolence. So that again makes me think, what about the Kingian philosophy of nonviolence then? Like, where the Black Americans were more loyal to King or to the principle of nonviolence. Yeah, I mean, these two are the main questions I have. And also on the code of Nanavati, if you can just share with us, like, where can we find, where can I read more on that code?
Okay, those are great questions. The Code of Nanavati, actually, if you read my article, I've written about it. It's an oral code, so it's not really written down. And there are many ways of interpretation of these oral codes, but I'm giving you sort of the standard interpretation, if you will. And so I've given a little bit more detail in my chapter on that. And so why did Ghaffar Khan join All India National Congress Committee? So this idea that it was a Hindu party, this came later on. This came during the time of partition, because there were a lot of Muslim members of the All India National Congress at that time, including the last president of the All India National Congress, Maulana Azad, right? So he was also a Muslim who was also part of the All India National Congress. And during so Farhan writes in his autobiography, his long autobiography, 600 pages, but just got translated into English, actually. And it's this new translation that has come out of his Pashto autobiography. So in that, he says that during this 1 year long of Peshawar riots, when he was imprisoned, he sent Khudai Khatmatgars and what was happening in the province, all the oppression that was going on in the province. He sent his 2 or 3 Khudai Khatmatgars to go and visit all the Muslim leaders. He said, go visit the Muslim leaders and tell them about the oppression that is happening in our province, and ask them to help us to make it public to the rest of India, because people don't know what's going on in our province, right? So these Khudai Khatmatgars did go to the Muslim League and presented their case to them, and they said they were ignored. So they came back to Ghaffar Khan and said they were totally ignored. They were not ready to listen to us. And the reasons for that was that our fight was against the British and theirs was not. The Muslim League were not fighting against the British. And they were actually, in a way, collaborating with the British, right? So this is very clear in their literature. And since then they said when we went to the All India Congress and we met with them, they were not only resisting colonial domination, but they were doing it non-violently the same way that we are. And so we could work with them. So the Khudai Khatmatgars never lost their title as the Afghan Jarga, right? So the Pashtuns are also called the Afghans at that time, before the formation of Afghanistan. So the category of the people, Afghan Pashtun, was interchangeable before the formation of Afghanistan as a country. So they were called the Afghan Jarga. So they never lost their identity. They didn't completely become part of the All India National Congress, even though when they won their elections from the province, they were called the Frontier Congress Committee, right? So they won their election through that ticket. So their frameworks were aligned, right? So that's why they said they wanted to be part of the All India Congress Committee and not part of the Muslim League. And the whole idea then, when the Muslim League did win, the idea of Pakistan came into being, that's why they were silenced, right? So they were considered traitors to the Pakistani state, and the movement was destroyed. And again, Bacha Khan or Ghaffar Khan spent more time in Pakistani prisons than he even did in British ones because of this opposition. But I think it's more of an epistemological opposition, right? So this whole framework of nonviolence was so in opposition to the nation state of Pakistan, that was just a derivative of the colonial state, that they had to suppress. They had to suppress that movement. And I think this idea of making a leader responsible for, and this is most of the histories about the Khudai, the very few that are available, makes Ghaffar Khan into this sort of miraculous leader who comes along and transforms a whole culture. And if you really think about it, how is that possible, right? However good the leader must be, he must be tapping into something that already exists in order for people to be following him in such large numbers, right? So I think, but he was also, a person of great integrity, a person who was part of his culture. So he would walk from village to village, much like Gandhi did, but Gandhi is a little bit removed from the masses, whereas Ghaffar Khan is always considered to be part of every village. So every village has a story that Ghaffar Khan came and he spent the night with us and he stayed here and he ate this. And so every person who was part of the Khudai Khatmatgar movement had a story about his personal interaction with them. So that, of course, did have a huge impact upon how people, whether they were loyal to him or just to the principles of nonviolence. But I think it can't just be explained in terms of loyalty to him. It's not possible for especially when you read that book, The Pathan Unarmed, when the Khudai Khidmatgar are being interviewed after so much repression of the Pakistani state, that they still identify as Khudai Khidmatgars. Why would they be doing so even now? So I think his leadership, of course, is crucial, but he is tapping into something that already exists in the cultural ethos, and people did take it on. And I think the next poem that I look at in the Bacha Khan's March on Mardan and the women's poetry, when we look at that next week, I think that makes it much more clearer about what they were thinking of nonviolence. So yes, I know, Martin. Okay, we'll ask the last question, and I think then we'll wrap it up for today. Yes.
Well, it's in line with exactly what you were saying, and also what Ayatakshi was saying. And that is, this is an amazing transformation. When I learned about it 20 years ago, I was so surprised that this had actually happened and then had been suppressed. But to me, the real message here is, what can we derive from this about how a transformation can happen? And obviously, it went in so deeply. Now, there was a lot that happened before 1928, 1930, those 2 or 3 years where it seemed like they converted from a violent culture to a nonviolent movement. It sounds like it was in a relatively short period of time. But what interests me is how that went in so deep. And obviously, this was a set group of people that all had a similar background. But what can we derive? And I guess I'd like to explore that a little more next time. If there's any application to today to get a nonviolent movement to be more widely accepted in some terms.
Yeah, I think that's sort of my impetus is towards that. If we can understand that nonviolence exists even in the places and cultures that are categorized as violent ones. If that is there already, it is part of that culture, but that is just represented as a violent culture, and so that is a really hopeful sign. But I think we need to understand the many levels in which the transformation occurred, and that it is to bring back our term of an intersectional form of resistance, right? So we have the discursive, we have the literary, we have the imaginary, we have the embodiment, the physical. We have these many, many layers in which this transformation is going on. And it's very interesting when we look at the women's poetry. I mean, I'm going to show you just a little bit, but I've looked at much more of the women's literature. They don't even talk about nonviolence. The term nonviolence does not even come up in their literature. And that's really, that's really interesting. Kaka, I'm sorry, I just saw your hand up too.
Okay, I will try to speak more quickly. So I was just questioning myself about, stimulated by the questions Ayatakshi brought, because I see that here also with different things. I was asking myself if these impressions has to do with how we tell stories generally, or in the mainstream. Because, for example, I know with Martin Luther King, Gandhi, and now I know about Hafarhan, they had large groups of people working with them, but generally the names of many of these people are not on the books. But we are not there, so it's very difficult. Maybe they were very important also, even in that time. I know some stories about Martin Luther King, about the importance of the groups of Black women before he took the leadership, like Rosa Parks and many things. And also I was, but we have this impression like it's the mainstream way we tell stories, glorifying generally a man. And not only these men, not only men does that, but many women, we also reproduce these patterns. And also I was, and also we focus on dates. Like I imagine that Hafarhan invested many years of this life, and Gandhi and Luther King and all these people invested many years before these crucial years we point also in history. But we also don't know much about that. And I was just noticing, it was very important to me what you said, because the violence of the oppressed is also super clearly and always pointed as violence and classified as violence, and the violence of the oppressors almost never. And many times what we call violence from the oppressed, you know, it's a whole debate that maybe it's too much for bringing here, but even violence is a very relative concept. And just pointing that generally what I see is that we as a society generally classify as violent, even unconsciously and unintentionally, using very sexist and racist lens, like animalizing people, but certain people, even feminizing the Pashtuns. For me, it's a kind of racist colonial violence, because women in a patriarchal world are inferiorized by proximity with nature. So I don't know, maybe it's a lot of complex ideas to talk about, but yeah. And who has the right to be a woman, and and who is animalized and in some way.
Yeah, those are great. No, complexity is very good. We want complexity in this course. Not let go of complexity is, I think, a problem. Yeah, definitely. So I think you bring up really great points about, first about the people who are part of movements are always left out of the movement, and the focus is always on the leadership, right? And I think the subaltern studies historians made this huge contribution in pointing to that. Like there's a very elitist kind of way in which history is written, and through the narrative of sort of the heroic figure coming and saving us all, right? So there's one heroic leader and he somehow transforms the people and saves us. So it's similar to how Gandhi is formulated, how Ghaffar Khan is formulated, how Martin Luther King is formulated. Many leaders, right? That's sort of the narrative that we have. One person, even in the film, right? The film, The Whale Rider, the prophet Paikea will come and save us, kind of thing, formulation. So the subaltern studies really did shift that, right? So it did say that no, it is made of resistance movements are made of so many people. So how are those people part of the movement? What is their consciousness, right? We are not looking at that consciousness at all. And it's not possible to have a movement without the people, right? So that we lose sight of that fact, that each person is contributing their consciousness to creating this larger consciousness, right? And so that's why I think we also feel very disempowered in the idea of creating movements ourselves, because we are always looking towards some leader to come along and to create even a movement. We don't feel we have the capacity to create movements and have the power to make a difference ourselves. So I think that's a great point that you raised, and the other great point that you raised is when people are categorized as violent, it's always through an essentialist lens, right? Always through a racial lens, always through these people are, that's the categorization without taking the context of why the violence is occurring, right? So that is completely out of context. The Pashtuns were categorized as violent when they are constantly resisting colonial domination, and that's why the categorization. And before that, they were resisting Mughal domination in the area. So this, that was the South Indian kind of categorization But they were also part of the dominant. They are also part of the dominant. You know, they did form governments in India a few times, took away the Mughal domination, and they formed governments. So that whole history is part of their categorization as a warrior people. And but if you take it out of context, then you just make it an essentialist, a racial category, right? So that, yeah, that definitely, that why are people being violent? That question never comes up. You know, why are people being violent? Why are they rebelling? Why are they doing what they're doing? It's not just like people have gone crazy all of a sudden. They're doing it for a particular reason, right? So those are great points. And I think you had one more, but I think I lost that. And let's pick up next time, because I think we've had a really wonderful discussion. And yeah.
Safura, one thing I just want to tell, that in Indian literature, especially a work done by Tagore in one of his novel, he writes about the Pathans, and he very explicitly talks about the generosity of Pathans and how warm-hearted and benevolent person they are. So I think the Bengali history, and me being a Bengali, I have read about Tagore's novels, and I remember reading this specific novel about Pathans. So today's lecture actually made me to recall about how Tagore has narrated the Pathans, and I would like to revisit that book
that's
again.
a great short. Yeah, that's a great short story. It's called Kabuliwala.
Exactly.
Yeah, it is a great short story, but I have a little bit of a critique against that also, because it does show the Pashtuns in a much better light, definitely. But it's also like this Pashtun, the Kabuliwala, is very childlike and simple-minded, and that's how he relates to the child. And he also becomes violent, right?
I mean, yes, later on, but he tells, like, a very subtle way, he tells that why he becomes violent and why he goes to the jail also in last year. And I remember I cried when I read that story when I was small.
That is a beautiful story. Yeah, you should read it again. Yeah, it is a nice story. Okay, great. See you all on Wednesday. Thank you again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much.